So let's straight away start. I'll give you some important facts about Brazil, US and India. Then where are we exactly in India in terms of the ethanol blending? The plans for 20% blending, where are we? How difficult is going to be? What are the challenges that we're going to face over the next 3-4 years? Some suggestions in the end on how we can overcome some of these challenges and how we can move forward. So first and foremost, Brazil and US produce almost about 80 to 85% of the world's ethanol. And US is the largest, 56 billion liters. Brazil is the second largest with about 32 billion liters. They consume about 30 billion liters from that and export a couple of billion liters into the international market. The third largest currently is the European Union at about 5 billion liters of ethanol every year. India is getting very, very close there. India this time we expect to about 4.715 billion liters. So in the next year we should be the third largest ethanol producer in the world. Some very important facts again about Brazil. As we discussed, I think somebody mentioned slightly early that why don't we move beyond 20% blending in India? I mean, it has to be step by step. Currently, we are doing 10%. The target is to do 20% in 2025. Brazil is already at 48%. So across the country in Brazil, they have an average of about 48% ethanol mixed into 52% of petrol. In the state of Sao Paulo, it is about 67% ethanol and 33% petrol. So that is the level at which we can go to. We can even go beyond 67 or 80%. But how will that will happen, I can discuss later. The numbers are right there, you can read it, about 337 sugar cane distilleries. So most of the ethanol produced in Brazil is from sugar cane. The corn-based ethanol distilleries are still very, very at a nascent stage, not doing as large as the sugarcane-based ethanol producers there. There's a very small sector, the 2G ethanol. A lot of us are interested in whether 2G ethanol can happen. It's happening. Brazil is doing it. They have two distilleries there producing ethanol from 2G, from bagasse basically, but not in very large quantities, just about 750 million liters. Most of that is getting exported into Europe, which faces a premium price in Europe because it is not produced from food crops, but comes from a waste. It is said that 1 liter of Brazilian ethanol still produces more than 30 times as many jobs as an equivalent liter of oil, coal or hydroelectricity. Just to give you the numbers, 30 times more, which clearly suggests that ethanol industry is a big job creator, big job generator, which is what is required in India. So we have all talked about the various benefits of ethanol pollution and how it's going to help the domestic industry, how we're going to reduce our import bill. But here is a number which suggests that ethanol is going to be the next big job creator in India also. Sao Paulo, which uses about 67% ethanol in their transport fuel, is probably having the best air quality in the world. And it's basically, we believe, and as my friends from Brazil suggest, is basically because of that ethanol that we use. Where are we in India? In India, as I mentioned, we have done 10% ethanol blending last year and used about 4.5 billion liters. If I just compare that with Brazil is currently producing 32 billion liters. US is producing 56 billion liters. We are still very, very young at about 4.5 billion liters of ethanol annually. The OMCs are blending or plan to blend about 12% ethanol in the ethanol supply here, which has started from the 1st of December. And for that, they have projected a requirement of 6 billion liters for the whole country. We have already contracted for about 4.7 billion liters. This is very early days in the season, in the year, and as we progress, probably we should get closer to that 6 billion liters of ethanol supplies in the country in the next 12 months. There has been a massive interest, there has been a lot of excitement amongst the investors. We have already heard the panel, very knowledgeable panel here of the sugar industry, talking about how the investors in the sugar industry, the sugar companies, are looking at ethanol as the next big opportunity. A lot of them have already invested. A lot of investments are happening in the expansion or in the new distilleries. And the grain-based sector is still a very nascent stage, still very early days for them. And some of them have developed the capacity, some of them have not been able to develop capacities. I'll discuss that slightly later. Now the 5 very important stakeholders, you would know everything. I'm just repeating, just reminding, and just talking about these things. Number 1, the stakeholder has to be the farmers. The farmers who produce sugarcane, and now the farmers who produce corn and rice or paddy. The second is the distilleries, sugarcane-based distilleries or the grain-based distilleries in the country who produce ethanol. That's the second biggest stakeholder. The third stakeholder is obviously the oil companies who are going to buy the ethanol, blend it with petrol, and then distribute it across the country. The fourth big and the most important, and I will show you why the most important stakeholder from now on is the automakers who are going to build the cars or the vehicles to take that kind of ethanol blend percentages. And the most important and the one in the center is the government. As my friend Mr. Tamak mentioned, we require stable and very proactive policies from there. So just replacing, we require enough feedstock to get that to 20% and beyond from the farmers. Ethanol production capacity needs to develop to produce that quantity which is required to be blended to reach that 20%. The right pricing has to be offered by the oil companies. As mentioned in the previous panel, you need to give the right prices for the syrup-based ethanol to ensure that more and more investments happen and that gets supplied, or we will see better pricing for the grain-based ethanol. And then the fourth one is you need to roll out the right kind of vehicles, the right quantity of vehicles, and I will talk about which will be the right kind of vehicles in the near future. And obviously, as I mentioned, a stable set of government policies with very proactive government there. Now this is something that I picked up from the Niti Aayog report of 2021. I'm sure a lot of you would be knowing this. Just look at the maroon portion. The fuel ethanol which is required by 2025 for that 20% blending as projected by Niti Aayog is about 10.16 billion liters. And if you add the requirement of the other users, that is for the liquor sector or for the chemical industry, then you add that and then you come to a total requirement of about 13.5 billion liters of alcohol or ethanol in 2025 or 2026 in that year. Now, another important thing that Niti Aayog has projected there is that half of that 13.5 should be coming from the sugar cane-based ethanol industry or alcohol industry, and another half should be coming from the grain-based. I will talk more about that because I still believe that not 50% but about 65%, 2/3 of the quantity should come from the sugar cane industry and about 1/3 will come from the grain-based industry. And why? I will discuss that in the next few slides. Now, first of all, the first important stakeholder. Do we have enough feedstock in the country? There was an important question raised by Mr. Harsh Soni. Do we have enough feedstock as we move on over the years in the future? So I've just dealt with, first of all, with the sugar industry. Obviously, the industry will have to produce that quantity of sugar which is required for the domestic market. And I believe that the domestic market, as mentioned by him also, will keep on growing, and we will require something like 28, 30, 32 million tons of sugar as we move on in the next 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, But I believe by 2025, when we require 20% blending, we should be requiring in the range of about 30 million tons of sugar. So if we produce 30 million tons of sugar, we would necessarily produce some B-heavy molasses or C-heavy molasses. So that molasses, if we convert, I have just taken the ratio of conversion of that into C-heavy molasses and converted that into the total quantum of ethanol which will get produced from the molasses from whatever sugar we produced, and that number comes to about 2.7 billion liters of ethanol by 2025 or so. And I believe that in 2025, currently also if you look at the numbers that the sugar industry is projecting, we would have about 10 million tons of surplus sugar that the industry is looking to export. So if we do not export and use all that surplus sugar to produce only ethanol, we should get another 6 billion liters in 2025 or 2024 from sugarcane alone. So therefore, as I mentioned, about 13.5 billion liters is required by 2025 for the 20% blending. If I deduct the availability of 8.75 from the sugar cane industry, we still are short by about 5 billion liters. Now, where does that 5 billion liters come from? That has to come necessarily from the grain-based sector. And this is what I was pointing out. Even though Niti Aayog believes that it's going to be a 50-50 share between the sugarcane industry and the grain-based, my personal belief is 2/3 will still come from the sugarcane industry and 1/3 will come from the grain-based because of various reasons, and I will talk about that in my next few slides. Now, where is this grain going to come back? Somebody asked that you are going to use the food grains that is currently being used for human consumption, and that's not the correct thing to happen in the long run. Currently, probably yes, because you are burdened with surplus rice. You don't know what to do with all the rice that FCI is buying. Till last year, FCI had almost 3 times whatever rice that they needed for the public distribution system. They have a buffer norm. The buffer norm, whatever they had 3 times of whatever they required. So they needed to actually get out of that situation, and therefore that rice is very well being used to produce more ethanol in the country. But then in the long run, you may not want to use more and more rice. So what do? I'm sure some of you would be knowing that 65% of the ethanol world over comes from corn, because the largest producer of ethanol is US, and US basically uses corn to produce ethanol. And therefore, corn is something that we should look at in the grain-based sector, because corn is in India, currently we are producing almost about 28 million tons. About 27 million tons or 26.5 million tons is what we use domestically. Most of them not for human consumption. About 65-75% basically goes either for animal feed or for starch making. And therefore only 25% is left for human consumption. So that debate of fuel versus food does not really happen in maize. We all should also know that our farmers grow corn and they are not able to even get 70% or 60% of the MSP promised by the government of India, because FCI or the state governments do not pick up corn like they pick up rice or wheat. And therefore the farmers who grow corn are not able to really find a market or not able to find the right price for what they produce. Now, the world average, I'm sorry it has the lowest couple of lines have gone down, but I'll read it out for you. Currently, India has an yield of corn of 3 tons per hectare. The world average is 6 tons per hectare. US has an average yield of about 11 tons per hectare, but they are using genetically modified corn seeds. But if I look at the world average of 6 tons per hectare, we are at half of at only 3 tons per hectare. Our neighboring country, Pakistan, has an yield of about 5 tons per hectare. So I am only assuming that if we do 5 tons per hectare only in the next 3 years or 4 years with the hybrid corn varieties that we have and being used across the country in small pockets, if we are able to give it to the farmers and they are able to use that hybrid varieties, and if we do 5 tons per hectare, we will have an additional about 18 million tons of corn. 18 million tons versus a requirement of about 12 to 14 million tons of corn, and therefore that debate about food versus fuel in the near future can actually take the back seat, and we can actually go ahead and use more and more corn in future. Now, Niti Aayog has also projected what is the capacity required to meet that requirement of 13.5 billion liters of alcohol and ethanol by 2025 for that 10% blending and for other uses. And they have said that about 15 billion liters should be the capacity, assuming that capacity utilization will not be 100%, or there might be some factories which may not work or work at much lower levels. And against 15 billion liters, in 2021, the capacity that was available in the country is about 7.03 billion liters of annual production. And therefore, Niti Aayog has projected that another 8 billion liters of annual production capacity is required between 2021 and 2025. I believe about 1.5 billion liters or even 2 billion liters of capacities would have got set up in the last 1 year or 1.5 years, and therefore we still need to create capacities worth about 6 billion liters in the country. Now, my belief, and I think from the panel which was here, is that the sugar industry should be able to meet the requirement that is being projected by Niti Aayog and expected by the government, and probably will do slightly more than that. And therefore, the capacities coming from the sugar industry is not a problem today. But where is the problem? The problem will be that the grain-based ethanol producers who have to fill that 30% or 35% gap for that 20% blending has to come up. The capacities need to be got built up there. Now, one main reason why the government really wanted to encourage grain-based ethanol production in the country was they realized that there will be a maximum limit of sugarcane every year. I'm not denying that sugarcane will keep growing as we move on every year, but in 2025 we might have a maximum limit, and therefore the production of ethanol may not actually be sufficient to give enough ethanol for 20% blending. Therefore they said, let's encourage grain-based. Second, as also shown in the slide presented by Mr. Tamak, is that about 80 to 85% of ethanol or sugarcane is grown basically in three states. Sorry, not shown by you, but basically 3 states grow about 80% or 75%. And therefore, ethanol will be concentrated from the sugarcane industry in these 3 states. And if these 3 states continue to produce 80% of the country's ethanol requirement, you will need a lot of logistic movement, lot of transportation across the country, lot of pressure on railways, lot of pressure on the roads, and you'll be burning a lot of fuel to carry fuel. And therefore the government said, let's broad base the production in the country. Let's also look at the other feedstocks like rice and corn. And you would also know that states which do not produce large quantities of sugar cane produce large quantities of paddy and corn. You talk about right from eastern UP, Bihar, Bengal, Assam, Odisha, Andhra, Telangana. So all these states produce a lot of paddy, they produce a lot of corn. Karnataka is probably one of the largest producers of corn. So therefore, you will see a lot of dual feed ethanol plants also coming up in our sugarcane based industry. I believe a lot of us have already invested. There are a number of them who would be setting up totally dedicated ethanol plants based on corn as well as sugarcane. Now the OMCs had also entered into long-term contracts, 10-year long-term contracts, and they had selected 131 dedicated ethanol plants. Dedicated ethanol plants they have defined as those who will be producing 100% ethanol and nothing else. And they had signed long-term contracts in January 2022, and they had given two deadlines depending on who was saying what. And first deadline is getting over in January 2023 as far as setting up the grain-based capacity is concerned. So out of 131, 120 of them are grain-based and only 11 of them are sugarcane-based. It's a different story why that happened. I don't want to get into that today. Now what has happened is in the last about 1 year out of 131, we believe only about 40 to 50 of them have really got the loans, and therefore the grain-based people are really lagging behind. And therefore, if the grain-based production capacities don't get set up in the near future, we will be missing the target of that 20% blending. Now what was the problem? They were not getting enough bank loans because most of the people who had signed long-term contracts with the oil companies were not found credit-worthy by the banks, and therefore loans were not getting extended to them. Price of rice and corn had jumped steeply, and I tell everybody, thanks to the Russian war with Ukraine, the price of rice and paddy in India has and corn has really jumped steeply. The price of fuel, which is rice husk basically for the grain-based sector, has also gone up 3 times.
Hello.
1,000 rupee increase in the rice husk results in an increase of 1.75 rupee per litre of ethanol cost of production. A year back, the price of rice husk was 3,500 per ton, and till about 2 months back, it was at about 10,500 per ton, almost about 7,000 rupees per ton increase, which actually caused an increase in the cost of production of ethanol by almost 10 rupees per litre. And that washed away all the margins, and therefore the excitement of the grain-based industry has really gone down. So what is the solution? First solution, there was a restrictive policy made by the oil companies in which they signed long-term offtake contracts with only 131 people. So open that up. Get new players who are more credit-worthy, new players who already have the approval of Department of Food and Public Distribution. Second, the ethanol price fixation for grain-based should be more realistic. It's still, there is a gap between the highest ethanol price and the grain-based ethanol price by almost 10 rupees. So there is a scope to increase it and make it more realistic. And lastly, as I mentioned, need to account for the price of fuel or the rice husk in the calculation of ethanol price. There is a big difference between the ethanol made from sugarcane and ethanol made from grain in terms of the fuel. The fuel used by the sugar industry to make ethanol is in-house. There is obviously a market value to that, but it is not open to too much of fluctuations as per the market price. Whereas the grain-based people have to buy rice husk and are open to major volatility in that fuel prices. So therefore, the oil companies or the government of India needs to think about taking into consideration the price of rice husk when they talk about the price of ethanol, which is not so much a problem in the sugar cane-based ethanol plants. So the most important hurdle in achieving 20%, this is the final thing that I wanted to discuss. First and foremost is there is adequate feedstock, as I mentioned, should not be a problem. Capacity creation is getting created. With a little more push, the grain-based will also take off. The OMCs are willing and are very keen with all the positive policies and are investing in the required infrastructure. Government policies and incentives are very positive and very proactive. But what exactly do we see as the problem as we move on to 2025, 20% blending? We are on track. Are we on the track as far as the consumption growth of ethanol is concerned? When I talk about consumption growth, I'm not talking about the oil companies picking up the ethanol. Finally, oil companies have to sell it to the vehicle owners, to the people like us who use the vehicle. Are we able to take that 10.16 billion liters of ethanol that we expect to produce, or that Niti Aayog or the Government of India expects to produce in 2025? The government has already announced, the Honorable Prime Minister in June 2021 said that all the new vehicles, two-wheelers, four-wheelers, everything that will be rolled out from April 2023 will be E20 compliant. As per statistics available, about 8% of the available vehicle fleet gets replaced every year. So if we talk about the next 3 years, from 2022 to 2025 or 2026 also, we are talking about a quarter, that is 8% every year into 3 years, a quarter of the vehicle population in 2025 will be E20 compliant. That means they can take 20% ethanol blended fuel, but the rest 75% will be still E10 compliant. That is, they can only take 10% or at best 12% ethanol blended fuel. So that means the demand will not grow at that pace that we expect, or will not reach that 10.16 billion liters of ethanol requirement by 2025, and therefore I fear there will be a lot of pain for all of us who are producing ethanol, because the demand will not have got created by 2025. So what do we do? The only solution, and this is the solution that Brazilians give us, is roll out flex fuel vehicles, do it quickly and do it strictly, seriously. Now, we all know that all the automakers who are producing vehicles in India are also producing the vehicles abroad in their own respective countries or in various countries, and they are producing flex fuel vehicles in, say, US, in Europe, in Brazil, in Thailand, and other countries. So the technology is there. The problem is not technology. There is a time gap, a time lag from the time they are going to start that production, because it requires a lot of changes in the assembly line, auto parts, etc. And the biggest challenge that these automakers tell us is the fact that India has a BS6 emission standard vis-a-vis BS4 emission standards in countries like Brazil. So if you're going to have BS6 emission standards for FFVs, the cost of the car or the two-wheeler is going to jump. And it's going to jump quite seriously by ₹1 lakh or 80,000 rupees depending on the size of the vehicle. And therefore, the fear will be FFV with BS6 in India will get rejected by the consumers because the cost is very high. Let's all know that we all first look at our own pockets before looking at the social benefits of pollution, etc. by FFVs. So therefore, and it was very encouraging to read the other day that Maruti Suzuki has announced rollout of Wagon R FFV BS6 emission standards by 2025. TVS has also announced that they will be rolling out their two-wheeler FFVs by 2024. But the time is to roll them out now, because the next 3 years you will not have enough vehicles, or by 2025 you will not have enough FFVs in the country. The difference between FFV and E20 vehicle is FFV can take something like on an average 80% ethanol, and therefore the demand for ethanol jumps by 4 times as compared to an E20 vehicle. Now, how do we encourage the FFVs with BS6? Because BS6 is something that the Honorable Supreme Court has said that India cannot change from BS6. So that's something that is already there. So therefore, to get FFVs with BS6, I am told that the automakers would want, number one, the productivity linked incentives, which is being given to so many other industry players, including for hydrogen fuel, including for the EVs. Lower GST rate for like the EVs. I think if they are going to roll out FFVs, it's still going to be charged at about whatever 40% or 38% of a cumulative tax that we pay on our vehicles. That's going to increase the price further. So can we have a 5% GST like done for the electric vehicles, or a 12% GST, which is going to reduce the, or a 12% GST, which is going to reduce the cost of FFBs to a more competitive level to make it more acceptable to the consumers of these vehicles. Now the most important one will be the FFB hybrids with batteries. This is something that I wanted to share with you. I was in Toyota factory in Bangalore, and they told me that the hybrids that they have currently requires a battery which you don't plug in for charging. It gets charged as you move on the road. It has a small battery in your boot, or now they have put it under your car. It's a small battery, it's not as big as an EV battery. So it runs on EV and petrol, but we can run that the battery along with ethanol also in future. Not only will it reduce the pollution level, but you don't have to plug it in every night to charge that battery. I have a Toyota Camry for the last 7 years. My battery in the engine has to be replaced twice in the last 7 years, but the battery in my boot I have not replaced for the last 7 years at all. When you start that car, you don't even know that it has started, because it's just soundless, it moves on that electric. Now what Toyota people told me, that you can produce 30 hybrid vehicles with batteries as compared to one electric vehicle. One electric vehicle requires 30 times the battery size that a hybrid vehicle requires. And the pollution level of an ethanol hybrid, battery hybrid car will be much, much less, because in India we still produce electricity. About 60% of electricity still comes from fossil fuel or from coal. So you will be polluting somewhere to generate that electricity to charge your plug-in batteries. Just one more statistics, about 1/3 of the total petrol consumption is by four-wheelers and 2/3 is by the two-wheelers. So it should be very easy for the government or the automakers to roll out a two-wheeler FFV very quickly. Concluding, in 2014, we were producing something like 380 million liters of ethanol. It was easy to move from that 380 million liters to 4.5 billion liters at 10%, because there was a lot of idle capacity in the country. There was enough feedstock in the country. People could just expand their capacities or set up new capacities very easily. So I personally believe it was not such a difficult path to achieve 10%. But to achieve 10% and move to 20% will be more difficult, because you're going to create so much more capacity. You're going to have to move so much of ethanol across the country. Logistics will be a problem, railways will be an issue. All those things will come up. Second is, India has, as I mentioned, India has abundant feedstock. I mean, you have to just increase your productivity, be it in sugar. As mentioned by Mr. Vijender Singh, about 3-4 years back, the millers in Uttar Pradesh used to produce just about 6 million tons of sugar. And today they're producing, probably if they don't divert into ethanol, they would have produced about 14 million tons of sugar. It's not by increase in the area, but only by better varieties which give you better productivity as well as better recoveries also. So you need to work there and ensure that you can get better productivity and not really get into the food crops so much. Grain-based ethanol plants need some more support, because it will not be possible at least till 2025 to achieve that 20% without involving the grain-based sector also. It is essential to quickly roll out FFVs, as I mentioned. Incentives, subsidies, tax concessions need to be given to FFVs with BS6, so that it becomes more acceptable to the users as far as the price of these FFVs are concerned. Lastly, public awareness and consumer education about ethanol itself and FFV will be essential as we move on from here. Thank you so much. That is all I have to say.
Thank you, sir. Very productive presentation. You highlighted all the facts right from the micro to major. Consisted of numbers, it has all. Thank you so much for the widespread of knowledge. That's why you are known as the expert from the industry. So we have a felicitation ceremony. May I please invite the founder, chairman of JK Group, Mr. Jeetu K. Shah on stage to felicitate Mr. Abinash Verma with a memento. Very warm welcome once again, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us the expert on Indian ethanol sector and Indian public policies, Mr. Abinash Verma. And we just had a talk on Indian ethanol scenario.